This is what fighter planes looked like in the early 1940s. Big props, exhaust stains down the sides, and top speeds around 350 miles per hour. But in 1944, something completely different appeared. It didn't have a propeller. It has some strange nacelles under the wings. But it was super fast, almost 200 miles an hour quicker than the Allied fighters trying to catch it. That is the Messerschmitt Me 262. Germany had been poking at jet turbines since the late 1920s, but it was mostly paper stuff. Concepts, sketches, theoretical work, while the real money and metal kept going into piston engines. Nobody was throwing away a perfectly good Daimler-Benz for some science project turbine. Yet. Then along comes Hans von Ohain, a young physicist who basically says, what if the exhaust itself is the thrust? He patents the idea of using gas turbine exhaust for propulsion and goes shopping for someone with money, factories, and patience. Ernst Heinkel, who's already a big name in German aviation, likes what he hears. He pulls von Ohain in, hands him resources, and says, all right, let's actually bolt this to an airframe. That path spit out the Heinkel HE-178. On the 27th of August 1939, it actually flew on turbojet power. The whole show lasted about 6 minutes. Because the engine ran so hot, the airframe was basically on a fuse. They figured it had maybe 10 minutes in it before it cooked itself. Even if it didn't blow itself into pieces, it only did about 372 miles per hour, which is barely faster than a production Bf-109 on a normal piston engine. The Nazi officials watching weren't particularly blown away. From their seat, they're thinking, this thing has a short lifespan, marginal speed gain, but tons and tons of risk, so why bother? But even though the HE-178 failed to impress, it did exactly what a first jet needed to do. Prove that you could hang a turbine on an airframe and actually fly the thing. While Heinkel is proving that a jet airplane can fly, the real answer to Germany's fighter problem is already being sketched somewhere else. Over at Messerschmitt, the Air Ministry is quietly shaping requirements for a proper, high-speed, high-performance jet fighter, something you could mass-produce and send into combat. But going from this flies to this can fight is where the pain started. The bottleneck was engines. Until the engine guys could tell you what they were really delivering, thrust, size, weight, fuel burn, the airframe guys were guessing. One engine? Twin? Maybe three? Nobody knew what the final layout should be. The engine problem was the hard part. Industry kept promising big numbers, and the airframers believed them and drew airplanes around those promises. The trouble was, the structures were basically ready by 1940-41, and the engines weren't. So Messerschmitt did the most practical thing. They stuffed a Umo 210 piston engine in the nose and flew the prototype like a conventional airplane just to prove the aerodynamics and structure while they waited for the real power plants to show up. From there, the requirements more or less drew the Me-262's shape for them. After the early jet tests, the spec was brutal, roughly 900 km per hour, and still able to operate off rough, unprepared fields. But since high speed pushes you toward thin wings for low drag, and rough fields demand big, fat tires, put those together and you've got a design headache. So you end up with a small fuselage, compact tail, and an airplane trimmed around speed. The wing had to stay thin, so there was nowhere sensible to hide those fat wheels out in the wing. The solution was to retract the main gear into the fuselage. The cockpit needed good visibility, so the forward fuselage is sculpted around the pilot. Then you still have to cram guns and fuel into the nose, and that's how you get that sharky, predatory look. On the surface, it looks like wind tunnel art, but most of that shape is just ugly packaging. On the way there, they tried plenty of dead ends, including BMW engines driving propellers, and broke a lot of ideas before settling on a clean, jet-only prototype. By then, the pressure was on. The British had already flown the Gloucester E-20-something test jet across the channel, and in the US, the XP-59A was coming together. Heinkel's HE-280 had flown as well, but constant arguments with the Reich Air Ministry gave Messerschmitt room to move. Finally, on the 18th of July 1942, the jet-powered Me-262 was ready to really show what it could do. The Me-262 was a different animal entirely. From the very first proper flights, the numbers were wild. On just its second flight, it climbed to around 11,000 feet and was already showing about 450 miles per hour. That instantly put it ahead of anything the Allies had in the air. Suddenly, German test pilots were seeing speeds everyone else was still only talking about. If you've spent your whole career strapped into 109s and 190s, with big pistons beating the airframe to death, a jet feels wrong at first. The thrust and acceleration are there, but the hammering and prop beat just vanish. It feels eerily smooth, like someone fast-forwarded the technology by 10 years in one hop. On paper, it looked like the wonder weapon the generals wanted to believe in. Jet thrust pushing it toward 540 miles per hour, 4 30mm cannons in the nose with roughly 80 shells per gun, enough firepower to erase a bomber in one pass. There was nothing Allied in the sky that could both catch it and outgun it at the same time. But buried under all that speed and firepower was a terribly short engine life. Those early jets had engine lives you could measure in missions, not in years. You were looking at maybe 60 minutes on an engine versus a Mustang that could stay in the game for 5 or 6 hours. In practical terms, that meant a 262 pilot could blast off, climb hard, make 1 or 2 attacks, and fuel and engine life will force him home. Then, just when things were already complicated, Hitler stuck his hand into the program and made it worse. He decided the Me-262 shouldn't just be a high-speed interceptor. It should also be a fighter bomber. But if you go back to the 1939 spec, they were drawing an interceptor, but Hitler wanted it to drop bombs on the battlefield at jet speeds. The problem is that the airplane just wasn't designed around that mission. Then they tried to turn that thoroughbred interceptor into a jet-powered Junkers Ju-88, and the airframe never stopped complaining about it. Even with all the delays and arguing, the Luftwaffe eventually had to get on with it. On the 19th of April 1944, they formed a dedicated unit at Lechfeld, just south of Augsburg, Commando 262, to introduce the jet into service and build a core group of pilots who could actually fly it. A lot of those pilots had a rough time with the airplane, especially in the pattern and on landing. In a Bf-109, you could just pull the power back, let the prop windmill, and float it down. But in the 262, that trick basically didn't exist. Even slow, you were still covering ground at a crazy rate. It's not that the Me-262 was some uncontrollable beast, it was just different. Everything happened faster. Approach and takeoff speeds were higher. The handling rules had changed. The small tail meant less directional stability, so it could get into a Dutch roll if you weren't ahead of it. It didn't have the same natural damping you'd get from a bigger fin and tailplane. Down in the slow end of the envelope, the relatively small ailerons didn't give you the kind of authority piston jockeys were used to, so sometimes you'd help a turn along with a little thrust tweak, even asymmetric power. For guys coming straight out of 109s and 190s, that was a very foreign way to fly. The cockpit didn't help. It was cramped, basic, and a bit awkward. And because Germany was building parts through a scattered network of labor camps and subcontractors, the instrument panels weren't always consistent from jet to jet. You couldn't count on everything being laid out exactly the same way every time you strapped in. The Me-262 had plenty of rough edges, but by mid-1944, Germany didn't have the luxury of waiting for a cleaner solution. The type was cleared for frontline ops, and whoever made it through conversion training got pulled into special jet squadrons to sit alert and wait. They didn't have to wait long. With thousands of Allied bombers pounding Germany daily, every flyable Me-262 and every pilot who could start one was thrown into the fight. On the 26th of July 1944, the Me-262 finally stops being a project and starts being a threat. That day, it becomes the first jet fighter used in combat. Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber gets behind one, bounces an RAF Mosquito over Munich, and leaves it so badly damaged it later crashes on landing in Italy. In a Mosquito, the 262 changed the whole geometry of the fight. The survival rule is to never let it get a clean visual and don't let it line up behind you, because once the jet had a clear picture of you, the closure rate and the 30mm battery gave it everything it needed in one pass. You normally won't spot the 262 first. What gave it away were warning calls that it is closing in. The only way to stay alive was to start working the Mosquito early, spoil the angle, and keep the jet from settling into position. With roughly a 100 miles per hour advantage, the Me-262 erased distance quickly, and if it ever stabilized behind you, the outcome was predictable. By late summer 1944, as more Luftwaffe pilots started taking Me-262 into combat, it really did look, for a moment, like Germany had finally found the tool that could punch through Allied bomber streams and their escorts. For a brief window, the Luftwaffe had a taste of the dominance they hadn't felt since the early years of the war. But like everything else in the story, it didn't last. On the front line, in its element, the Me-262 could feel untouchable, but its glass jaw was always the low-energy bits of the flight, takeoff and landing. Down there, it could be sluggish, slow to accelerate, and vulnerable. By the late war, Allied fighters learned to simply wait near the jet bases. A lot of the high-value Me-262 kills happen either as they're dragging themselves off the runway or trying to get back on it. Nobody wanted to fight a 262 at 25,000 feet. The smart play was to hit it when it was dirty and slow. Once Allied pilots got over the initial shock of the wonder weapon, they adapted. Mustang drivers learned they could match or come close to the jet's speed in a dive, and they also knew the 262 couldn't just yank around like a conventional dogfighter. So they started stalking it, using energy and position, and slowly worked their way into weapons range. Little by little, they turned a terrifying unknown into a target they could pick off. The other reality was that even seeing a 262 at all became rare. Germany had lost its main oil sources. The Allies were squeezing from both east and west, and fuel shortages strangled operations. On paper, lots of engines and airframes were built, mostly by forced labor in scattered camps, but only about 400 complete Me-262s actually reached frontline units. Germany simply couldn't afford to keep building its cutting-edge jet, and in the last phase of the war had to shift towards simpler, easier-to-produce aircraft. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, the Me-262 production effectively died. Hitler's jet dream ended with the rest of the regime. After the war, anything that still looked vaguely like the Me-262 was scooped up by whoever got there first. Soviets, Americans, British. Everyone wanted to study it, and it became a reference point for global jet development. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.